In February 2003, a family of 5 simply stopped answering their phone. No note, no forwarding address, no goodbye to the staff who worked for them, the neighbors who lived beside them, or the relatives who called them every week without fail. One day they were there, a father, a mother, a grandmother, and 2 baby boys, the youngest just 8 weeks old. The next day, they were gone. Police were told not to worry. Friends said the family had probably gone home to India. It happens, people said. People leave. It would take 10 weeks, 2 bodies pulled from the sea, a confession from a terrified man in a boarding house lounge, and a single scrap of paper hidden inside a dead man's sock before anyone understood what had really happened to the Chohan family, and just how far one man was willing to go to steal a business worth £3 million. This is that story. Anil Chohan ran a fruit importation company out of Heathrow called Seba Freight. By all accounts, he was a soft touch of a boss, the kind of man who bought pizza for the warehouse floor on a busy shift, who joked with his drivers, who treated the company more like an extended family than a business. He'd served time himself, years earlier, for tax evasion, and it had left him with an unusual generosity toward people trying to rebuild their lives. He gave second chances. He gave 10th chances. At home, he had a wife, Nancy, and 2 small sons, 18-month-old Devinder and his baby brother, just weeks old. Nancy's mother lived with them too, having come from India to help with the children. By every outward measure, it was a full, happy household. In January 2003, a man walked into Seba Freight looking for driving work. He called himself Ken. Anil, true to form, barely hesitated. He hired him on the spot. What Anil didn't know, what almost no one at the company knew, was that Ken Regan had spent the previous decade as one of the more successful drug smugglers operating out of the Heathrow freight corridor. In the criminal underworld, he'd been known, half admiringly, as Captain Cash, a man who carried briefcases full of high-denomination notes and spent lavishly to prove he'd arrived. He had used freight companies just like Seba as fronts to move heroin into the country for years. In 1998, that had all come apart. Regan was caught with 25 kilograms of heroin, enough to guarantee him the better part of 2 decades behind bars. Facing that, he made a calculated decision, he informed. His testimony helped convict a dozen major criminals, and in exchange his own sentence was cut dramatically. He walked free in 2002 with almost nothing left, his assets stripped by a confiscation order, reduced to sleeping in a single room of his elderly father's bungalow. By the time he arrived at Seba Freight, Kenneth Regan was a man with nothing, standing in the middle of exactly what he needed to get everything back: a bonded warehouse, import licenses already in place, and an owner too, trusting to ask hard questions. Regan didn't waste time. Within weeks of starting as a driver, he approached Anil directly with an offer that seemed too good to question. He said he knew investors, serious money, looking to buy exactly this kind of business. The number he floated was £3 million in cash. For Anil, the timing couldn't have been better. Nancy had been asking him for over a year to slow down, to consider moving the family back to India, where she felt her children would get a better start in life. £3 million solved that problem in one stroke. Anil began, quietly, to consider selling. While that offer sat with Anil, Regan was working a second angle entirely, one that had nothing to do with fruit importation and everything to do with an obsession he'd been nursing for 5 years. Long before prison, Regan had become fixated on a woman he'd met in a London bar, a well-connected socialite who at the time had a beautiful home, a demanding lifestyle, and absolutely no romantic interest in him whatsoever. He called her constantly. He told mutual friends she was his girlfriend, which she wasn't and had never been. His obsession only paused because he was arrested and imprisoned, and the moment he was released, he picked the calls back up as if no time had passed. By 2003, that woman had left her old life behind for a quieter one on a farm in Devon, newly single, financially stretched, with 2 children in private school and a mortgage she was struggling to cover alone. Regan called her with what he framed as a straightforward business proposition. He was about to take over a freight company, and he needed a managing director. The salary he offered was enormous for someone with no relevant experience, enough, eventually, to be genuinely hard to turn down. She took the job. It gave Regan a standing excuse to visit her Devon farmhouse regularly, always for some minor pretext, a form to sign, a document to review, despite living hours away. And each time he visited, something strange happened. He became fixated not on her, but on her land. He complained about the mud. He talked about clearing trees, building a wall, putting up electric gates. He kept circling back to one particular fix. What this place needs, he told her more than once, is a drainage ditch. She thought it was an odd, slightly overbearing kindness from a business associate. She had no reason yet to wonder why a man she barely knew was so preoccupied with the exact shape and depth of a hole in her field. By February, Anil had made his decision. He agreed to meet the investors Regan had described. On the Thursday morning before Valentine's Day, the 13th of February, 2003, he left the office telling staff he had a meeting near Stonehenge. He never came back. 3 days later, on the Monday, SEBA's employees arrived to find the company had a new owner. Regan stood in front of the gathered staff and introduced the Devon farmhouse owner as the new managing director. He explained that Anil had sold the business and retired abroad, along with Nancy, due to ill health. He produced a letter to that effect, signed, as far as anyone could tell, by Anil Chohan himself. No one questioned it out loud. It was a busy warehouse, and there was work to do. But privately, more than a few people found it strange that a man who joked with them daily hadn't said a word of goodbye. 2 days into her new job, the newly installed managing director felt unwell and drove home early to Devon, and arrived to find a digger tearing a long trench across her field, operated by 2 men she recognized as friends of Regan's. When she confronted Regan about it, he told her, without apparent irony, that he'd assumed she'd be pleased. He was building her the drainage ditch he'd been talking about for months. She had it stopped. She would have had it filled back in, except that, within weeks, the Metropolitan Police would dig it up for her. 12,000 miles away in New Zealand, Nancy's brother, Onkar, had spoken to his sister and mother almost every day for years. On the 15th of February, the calls simply stopped. He tried again, and again. Nothing. He contacted the Metropolitan Police, who opened a routine missing persons inquiry. It didn't go far. Neighbors and colleagues told officers what they'd assumed all along, that the family had likely gone back to India, as Nancy had wanted for so long. Under British law, adults are entitled to leave the country without telling anyone. There was, on paper, nothing to investigate. Onkar didn't believe it for a second. He flew to England, a country he had never visited, and let himself into his sister's empty house in Hounslow to see for himself. What he found stopped him cold. Children's toys, scattered on the floor exactly where they'd been dropped. Baby bottles, still full, in the refrigerator alongside uncooked food. And, in a drawer, his mother's prayer book, the one object she was never, under any circumstances, without. A family does not pack up their lives and vanish while leaving behind a mother's prayer book and a refrigerator full of food. Onkar went back to the police and refused to leave until someone listened to him properly. This time, they did. A full investigation was launched, led by Detective Chief Inspector Andy Rowell. The first person detectives spoke to was the last man known to have seen Anil Chohan, Kenneth Regan, who told them a story about a struggling, dishonest businessman who'd chosen to disappear rather than face his creditors. Detectives weren't convinced, and they had a tool Regan hadn't accounted for: mobile phone tower data, which could reconstruct, almost minute by minute, where a phone and its owner had been. The data told its own story, and it flatly contradicted Regan's. On the day Anil disappeared, his phone left Hounslow and traveled toward Stonehenge, exactly as he'd told staff. But it didn't stay there. It met Regan's phone near Stonehenge, and from that point, the two phones traveled together, further west, toward Salisbury. specifically toward a village called Wilton, where Kenneth Regan lived. The only other lead detectives had in the area was the newly installed managing director of Seba Freight, now living on a farm in Devon. They arranged to visit her. When Regan found out the police were coming, he reacted with unusual urgency, insisting she not let officers into her house. Meet them somewhere else instead. Anywhere else, just don't let them inside. She found the demand strange but hadn't yet connected it to anything sinister. That same day, one of Regan's associates, a man named William Hornsey, contacted police directly, claiming he'd recently been in contact with Anil Chohan and that the missing businessman was alive, on the run, and hiding from his creditors. He offered to help arrange a handover. Chohan, he said, was planning to meet him near the passport office in Newport, Wales, to collect stolen travel documents. It was enough to redirect the entire operation. The planned visit to Devon was cancelled. Detectives instead traveled to Newport, to a stretch of pavement beside a well-known bronze pig statue outside the passport office, and waited. Hornsey showed up. So did Regan. The two men stood around for a while, checking their phones, and then staged, rather theatrically, a sudden phone call and a look of alarm. Someone, they said, had tipped Chohan off that the police were involved. The deal was off. They left. Detectives traced the call. It came from an unregistered, untraceable phone. They had just watched a performance, staged for their benefit, to buy time and pull them away from Devon. With the Wales lead exposed as a stunt, police returned to their original plan and brought the Devon managing director in for questioning. As she was leaving her house that day, Regan pulled her aside with one more instruction. If the police ask what I was doing on your land, tell them I was helping fix your water system. It struck her as an odd thing to need covering. No one had touched her water system. What Regan had actually done, with two accomplices and a hired digger, was cut a long trench through her field. She told detectives exactly that. The reaction in the room was immediate. Two experienced officers looked at each other, and one of them asked her to repeat, precisely, what had been dug into her land. Within days, forensic archaeologists were on site in Devon, working the trench inch by inch with brushes and hand trowels. After 5 painstaking days, they found no bodies. But they did find traces that mattered enormously. Burned fabric, jewelry, strands of hair. Laboratory testing matched the hair to members of the missing family. The conclusion was as clear as it was horrifying. Someone had been buried in that field, and someone had since dug them back up and moved them elsewhere. In April 2003, more than 2 months after Anil Chohan vanished, 2 friends went out canoeing in calm evening water off the coast of Bournemouth. Enjoying the conditions, they paddled further than they normally would, and one of them noticed something floating ahead of them in the water. It took a moment to register as a human body. They stayed with it in the dark for close to 3 hours until rescue services arrived. It would take almost a week for the body to be formally identified. It was Anil Chohan. A post-mortem examination found he had suffered a heavy blow to the back of the head, and that packing tape had been wound around his mouth. The cause of death was recorded as suffocation, following that initial blunt force trauma. For Ankar, flown back from New Zealand to identify what remained of his family, it confirmed the worst without yet answering the question that mattered most. Where was everyone else? Around this time, the Devon farmhouse owner had an unnerving roadside encounter of her own. Driving down a country lane with a torn horse blanket on the passenger seat, she came across Regan and Hornsey parked in a car, waiting. They wound down the window and told her they needed to talk. Asked her to get in the car. She stalled, said she had to return the blanket first, drove around the corner out of sight, and immediately called the detective leading the investigation. He told her, in no uncertain terms, never to get into a car with either man. Officers were dispatched to the lane within minutes. By the time they arrived, Regan and Hornsey were gone. The 2 men had fled to mainland Europe. A third man involved in the plot, Peter Rees, stayed behind and didn't handle being left holding the aftermath particularly well. On the run and increasingly unable to cope, Rees took a room in a boarding house under an assumed calm. Within hours of moving in, He was pouring out a confession to his landlady, a woman who had never met him before that day. He asked if she'd seen him on television. He told her he'd been involved with a family that had disappeared. An Asian family, he said, 3 adults and 2 babies, and that although he could be placed at the scene where they were buried, he hadn't killed anyone. That, he insisted, over and over, had been Regan. He's a psycho, he told her. He killed them all. He shot the kids. The landlady called the police the moment she reasonably could. 12 days after fleeing, Peter Reese was arrested at a nearby pub. He would not repeat a word of his confession under formal questioning, but it was already too late to take it back. His landlady had heard every word, and she remembered all of it. 3 weeks later, a fisherman working the Solent noticed something in the water that made him stop hauling his nets. The body recovered that day was identified as Nancy Chohan. Kenneth Regan was tracked down and arrested in Belgium after roughly 2 months on the run. William Hornsey surrendered 6 weeks after that. All 3 men, Regan, Hornsey, and Reese, were now in custody. All 3 refused to answer a single question put to them by police. With 3 of the 5 family members still unaccounted for, and no one willing to talk, detectives were left to build their case entirely on physical and forensic evidence. It would eventually total almost 4,500 exhibits, bank transactions, phone records, petrol station receipts, assembled over what would become the longest-running criminal trial in the history of the Old Bailey. Nancy's mother would eventually be recovered from waters off the Isle of Wight. The bodies of the 2 Chohan boys, Devinder, 18 months old, and Ravinder, just 8 weeks old when he vanished, have never been found to this day. Detectives had phone data placing Regan, Hornsey, and Reese with Anil Chohan on the day he disappeared, and tracking all of them to Regan's home address in Wilton, 3, Forge Close, for a stretch of days with no gaps. They had a burial site with matching forensic traces. When they searched Regan's actual home, though, they found the room recently redecorated, carpet gone, furniture replaced, a strong indication someone had cleaned up a crime scene, but not, on its own, proof of murder. The evidence that would finally close the case had been sitting in police storage for close to 8 months, overlooked simply because no one expected it to matter. At Anil Chohan's original post-mortem, his clothing had been sent for forensic testing. All of it, except one item that's rarely considered evidentially significant, a single sock. It was submitted late, almost as an afterthought, for the sake of completeness. When a forensic scientist finally examined it properly, months after the initial recovery, she found something folded inside it. A small, waterlogged scrap of paper, folded and refolded so many times it had softened almost like fabric. Carefully unfolded under laboratory conditions, it turned out to be a building society letter, dated the 12th of February 2003, the day before Anil disappeared, addressed to Kenneth Regan, at 3, Forge Close, Wilton, Salisbury. Detectives believe Anil Chohan, held at Regan's house in the last days of his life, managed to get hold of a piece of Regan's own post, perhaps the only paper within his reach, and folded it small enough to hide inside his own sock. It's hard to read that as anything other than a man who understood by that point exactly what was likely to happen to him, and who tried, in the only way available to him, to leave behind proof of where he'd been held. It was the single piece of physical evidence that placed him unmistakably inside that house. He had left it there himself. The trial opened at the Old Bailey in April 2005 and ran for 9 months. Prosecutors argued that Regan's plan had started simply: get rid of Anil Chohan and take control of his company, but that once he'd taken that first step, he was left with no way to stop. Nancy would have raised the alarm the moment her husband vanished. So, prosecutors argued, would her mother. And the 2 young boys were too young to ever be anything but witnesses to whatever came next. The prosecution described the crimes as, in their words, beyond belief. The jury reached its verdict after almost 4,500 exhibits and 9 months of testimony. Peter Reese was sentenced to 23 years for the murder of Anil Chohan. William Hornsey and Kenneth Regan Each received 5 consecutive life sentences, one for every member of the family who died. Neither man will ever be released. While going through the family home in the early days of the investigation, Onkar found an old home video, recorded just 2 days before his sister's family disappeared. It shows Nancy laughing at the camera, a baby cooing. An elderly woman, Nancy's mother, laughing at something off-screen, and toward the end of the tape, 18-month-old Devinder taking some of his very first wobbling steps across the living room floor. In the same house, Onkar would later search room by room, looking for any sign of where they'd gone. It remains the only time Onkar ever saw his sister's entire family together, captured, by chance, only 2 days before all 5 of them were gone. Devinder and his baby brother Ravinder have never been found. If this story got to you, subscribe, like, comment, and share. New story every week.